So for story time today, we're going to look at a man called Joseph. Joe for short. Joe, it was a bit shortest. Anyway, so Joseph was a pretty amazing guy. Now, the little bit of a story about Joseph. Joseph was not liked by his brothers very much. We looked at this last week. Joseph was not a very popular brother. He had his big flashy coat and he was a bit full of himself, I think you could probably say, and he wasn't very popular. So his brothers, they hatched up this, well, it wasn't such a good plan in one sense, in any way, because they sold him to work for somebody else, which wasn't very nice because they didn't own him, but they sold him anyway. And eventually, Joseph, who had been a shepherd, so he's sold into slavery, which is pretty boo. There you go. So he's sold into slavery and eventually goes to work for a man called Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was a guy that hired Joseph, and if you've ever watched, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice, the BBC classic Pride and Prejudice, you got all these layers of servants, and right at the very bottom of the servants, it's probably someone that would clean the shoes, maybe. And that's what Joseph started out. So he entry-level job, really. But he worked really hard and he was really faithful to his master, to his boss, to Potiphar. And eventually he became housekeeper, kind of like a butler, if you're thinking about that. So it's like the top level of the servant. So that was kind of awesome. Some bad stuff happened and then Joseph found himself in prison, wrongly committed for a crime he did not commit. But in prison, some really good stuff happened because Joseph met a baker and he met a cupbearer. Let's forget that name. Now, Joseph was trusted so much by the people in the prison, he was actually allowed and trusted to look after the other prisoners. Now, if he wasn't a very nice man, he might have opened up the gate and then all the prisoners could have said goodbye and they'd have been off on their way. But Joseph was a really honest man, so he cared well for the people in the prison. And that's how he got to know the cupbearer and the baker. Now, the baker probably would have worn a hat, a bit like the chef hat, okay? And the cupbearer probably wouldn't. But the cupbearer is an interesting one. It's not something we'd really have today. We'd use machines or technology or sensors or something. But the cupbearer was a really important role. So we are, I don't know, 4,000 years ago in time. And back then, if you didn't like the king or the queen, you might try and, lose them. It happens. So, and this is what the cupbearer was there to stop. Because the cupbearer, it's kind of a good job. I suppose, because the cupbearer got to eat and drink all the best foods just before the king or the queen. And as long as the cupbearer didn't die, then the king or queen would eat their food. So they got some really nice food, but there was always the risk of eating the food, saving the life of the king or queen, but not making it to tea time. So that wasn't so good. But now the cupbearer and the baker, they'd upset the king. So the king said, right, off to prison. And while they were there, they had some dreams, and Joseph interpreted the dreams. So this is Joseph with the fancy coat, Technicolor dream coat. He interprets the dreams, and they think, this is amazing. This is kind of cool, isn't it? Anyway, they go on, and one day the king is there, and one of these people is there, and the king has a dream, and he says, if anybody can interpret my dream, I'll give you all sorts of really cool stuff. And nobody could. They all tried because it's like win a million quid if you can interpret my dream. No one could. And Joseph was remembered as someone who interprets dreams. The king said, come and get me Joseph quickly. So Joseph goes to the king, and the king says, here's my dream, Joseph. And Joseph says, this is what your dream means. And the king says, yes, that's it. I'll tell you what, Joseph, I'll make you second in command of the entire country. So you got the king, and then you got Joseph. Now, don't forget, Joseph started life in this area of the world. He started life as the lowest servant, rose to become a butler, went into prison, which wasn't so good, slowly rose up the ranks of not quite. And then he sees the king, and the king says, right, you're second in command. You don't have to answer to anybody. Whatever you do, the only person you have to answer to is me as the king. And that's the story of Joseph and his jobs. He had quite a few. So he had a shepherd. He worked for a man called Potiphar, became a servant, became a butler. He went to look after the prisoners in prison when he was wrongly convicted, sent to prison. He meets a baker and a cupbearer, and eventually the king appoints him second in command to Pharaoh. Now, if you ever think about writing a CV when you're getting older, a CV is you send it off to somebody and say, look at what I've done. And if your CV said I was a shepherd and I was a lowly servant, well, you might be looked at okay. But if your CV said I was second in command of a country, you'd probably get the job, whatever it was. And that's Joseph and his jobs.